Tony Dunst joining us now in studio here live on Behind the Mic. He is a professional gambler and co-host of the World Poker Tour show on FS1. Tony, great to have you in. How are things going tonight, man? We know you're coming in from Vegas.
Yeah, that's right. Coming in from Vegas, but I actually went to a casino right when I got off the plane here in LA. So
there you go, staying true to the roots.
Yes, exactly.
Well, right off the bat, it's such a hot button topic right now with sports becoming legalized within the last couple of months. Keith and I have talked about that a lot on the show. We had Tim Donaghy actually call in several months ago, and we got his thoughts on kind of the current status of everything and where things are going to be going in the future. And I'm just curious right off the bat here to get your take on just the current status of how gambling is going and the tie-in with sports. I know we were talking off the air. We see more and more now ESPN showing the World Series of Poker, for example, and really just promoting it. And really, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, I think, of things to come.
Yeah, I'm very excited for this change, and I think everyone working within the realm of gambling or in the gaming industry is very excited for this, because not only does it mean a lot more access to sports betting and a lot more money flowing through the gambling economies, but it also means a loss of stigma about gambling. And I can tell you, as a career professional gambler and growing up in a world that in an American society that viewed gambling with a lot of skepticism, it's really refreshing to see people treat this in a mature way.
And so how does it work? Because I'm really interested and intrigued in terms of your profession, in terms of the world tour, the poker tournaments and things like that. First off, how did you get into it? Like, how did this all come about?
I got started playing poker way back in late high school. Around that time, poker in the form of the World Poker Tour and the World Series of Poker was becoming very popularized on TV, and online poker had just burst out onto the scene, and really gambling online was a very new area. I can remember in the early 2000s selling items that only existed on video games, and everyone, especially my parents, thought I was crazy. They're like, who's going to pay for something that only exists in a virtual space? Well, now we see that as very mundane. We buy something on our phones that only exists in a virtual space every single day. So the prospect of being able to play online poker when I was just messing around with my friends was so enticing, and created this massive opportunity, especially for men and women my age at that time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and obviously we've come such a long way. Are you surprised at maybe how fast people have changed their minds, obviously in the sports world, number one? I mean, when we think about it, the NFL, for example, as a lot of us know, wouldn't allow the referees to even go to Vegas unless they had some kind of medical emergency during the offseason, for example. How things have changed since then.
Yeah. I am of the opinion that nobody has changed their minds. They have simply adjusted to the reality of a better bottom line, which is every major sports organization has become convinced that partnering with gambling firms or allowing gambling on their sport is going to be good for business. One thing we experienced in the daily fantasy sports industry was that teams that had fairly weak fan support, and especially were getting blown out in the second half of games, were actually retaining some viewership, because people like me and many of my peers were really curious to see, well, what about all those bench players, and what about all these guys that we rostered on our teams regardless of the outcome of the game themselves? You're going to see more and more of that, and the leagues are aware of it, and the fact that any amount of money that people bet on a game generates interest.
Let me ask you, is there a strategy to actually betting on a certain game? Or because for the big guys like myself who are beginners in terms of betting games, right? What is the strategy that you guys have in terms of like knowing what to do in terms of the right pick or not? There has to be a secret, right? So what is that? What is the strategy that you would go by?
Well, the secret in a word is price. A lot of people believe that sports betting and the analysis there is really all about your ability to predict what happens next in a sporting event. But look, there are guys whose entire career is scouting or sports analytics or decision making within sports, and as we know, it's a really, really difficult competitive field. So in sports betting, the primary thing you're concerned with is price. And so you might have a really strong hunch, or you may even have some data that you believe leads you to making a bet on a certain team. But if the price is wrong, if the vigorish or the rake, as we would say in poker, is too high, you probably shouldn't make your bet. Meanwhile, Another thing you can do, especially in a city like Las Vegas, is compare the prices of various casinos and various sports books and then go hunt down the best one. So, first you come up with whatever you think your pick is going to be, and people have lots of different means of arriving to their conclusions about who do I want to bet on. But the real secret sauce is in getting the best price.
We're talking to Tony Dunst, professional gambler and co-host of the World Poker Tour on FS1, joining us here live in studio. Is it something that came naturally to you, or did you have to really work at, like you said there, learning how to maybe place certain bets down and just kind of, was it more so naturally, or was it more of like a feeling out process?
Coming from the world of poker, sports betting was natural in the sense that I accepted that my reads and my guesses were probably valueless. That really it had to be a data-driven decision, and that in poker, a lot of whether you should sit in a game or whether you should call somebody with a hand is kind of putting the pieces together of all these little data points that you have and all the patterns that you've been able to pick on, typically through your history, and not what often people think is like, well, I looked in the guy's face and then he scratched his eye a little bit and then I knew what to do. A lot of poker actually is more data-driven, just as sports are data-driven. So I think there was a natural parallel there.
But just kind of follow up on that one, is that something that is more recent, or has it always been more so that way as far as being data-driven? Has that come here with just like the evolution of technology, or what's the insight into that?
Well, I will say that my getting into sports betting as a form of income is fairly recent, within the last couple of years. So it's difficult for me to speak about what it was like 15 years ago because I would sort of be guessing. I do know from reading a lot about how other professional sports bettors think this law is going to impact change, that it used to be easier to make money at this, that the books used to be less sharp about catching on when somebody was really, really good at what they were doing and has had an edge on them. They used to share less data with each other. And they used to be less precise in the lines that they would put out. I can tell you right now that if you're in Vegas and you want to do professional sports betting, you have to be like at the casino, minutes away from the sports book, ready to jump up and get the best price. As compared to, from what I understand, 10 to 15 years ago, it's sort of like you'd wake up in the morning and you'd see which casinos were offering prices, and you could go over there hours later and trust that it was still there. They weren't adjusting as quickly.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about the World Poker Tour that's going on? I know I watch some poker on ESPN, of course, and those guys, the intimidating looks they have on their face, you have to have. Can you give us some enlightenment what goes on in the World Poker Tour?
Yeah, absolutely. So the World Poker Tour offers live tournaments in a bunch of venues, primarily in North America, but increasingly international. We're really proud of the fact that we're expanding in Asia, that we have numerous events.
I see.
In Europe. We had South America last year, had an event in Uruguay, our first one in Brazil. And what event you want to play kind of depends on your tier of experience. If you want to come play in our main tour, which is going to be like a $3,500 to a $10K buy-in, odds are you should either be very comfortable financially or you should be a really serious poker player and probably somebody who does this for a living. But if you're just a lover of poker, you want to play a tournament, take your shot at that big money without something that might really hurt your monthly budget, then maybe you come out for a WPT national event. We offer like a $500 or $1,000 tournament, and that's still going to generate a big prize pool where first is going to be like six figures.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because if I'm a beginner, right, I'm looking to get into it, it's like, where do I start?
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing, right?
Absolutely.
Where do I go initially? And I think it's cool that we talked about this off the air before tonight's show, these other countries and how this is nothing new for them as far as like legalized gambling goes.
Exactly.
And how it's such a different mentality here in the United States. And I know you lived in Australia for a period of time as well. Kind of compare and contrast that experience to here in the U.S.
Yeah,
as far
it's
as
really
living.
Odd. I lived in Australia for 5 years, and legalized gambling has been part of their legal fabric for decades now. And there, when you want to make a sports bet on something, it's just like you go out your house and you walk down the street to the I can't remember what the term they had for it, but it was something like punter shop or something, and you just go, you buy your bet as if you're at like a 7-Eleven or something, and it's very mundane in a way. And there was so much stigma around gambling in the United States that people are having conversations about, like, well, what happens if we allow everybody access to this, and are we going to have all kinds of crazy problem gamblers? And look, problem gambling is a serious issue, and it's one that does need to be addressed through tracking customer habits and giving people support if they do have those kind of problems. But I very much believe that gambling is something kind of inherent in the human character, and it's something that so many of us are going to do that we serve ourselves and serve our society much better by doing this legally and transparently than allowing it to be serviced through a black market.
Yeah, fascinating, right?
Yeah, that is fascinating, man. I'm excited, man. I'm excited with what you're doing here, and it really shows a lot of interest in stuff. The World Poker Tour, I'm really going to be paying attention to that. I'm trying to get into it. You got to show me some tricks in the trade,
sure,
man.
You got to
show me. You got to show me a little bit of something. I'm going beginner, $500 buy-in. I can do that.
Okay, you guys want to talk about like a few like really simple tells that you might spot at the poker table that will actually be kind of consistent?
So hold that thought.
Sure.
We'll get back to it on the other side.
Yes.
We're talking with Tony Dunst here live in studio behind the mic. Back in a flash.
You're listening to Behind the Mic with Brad Dalius.
I wanna hold them like they do in Texas, please. Fold them, let them hit me, raise it, baby, stay with me. I love it. Love game, intuition, play the cards with spades to start.
11:19, great to have you with us as we roll along on this Tuesday evening. Brad and Keith hanging out behind the mic live here on KABC Radio. We're joined in studio by Tony Dunst, professional gambler, poker player, also the co-host of the World Poker Tour show on FS1, talking a lot of gambling here, a lot of Vegas, legalized sports gambling, the big news, obviously, within the last couple of months. And how much longer till we maybe see the kiosk inside the sports stadiums, the arenas? I think we're probably getting close, right?
We're getting close. My guess is we're still a few years away, and it's going to depend on a state-by-state basis, because what the passage of the law really was it said the Wire Act does not apply to states being allowed to pass legalized sports betting. It was New Jersey that actually sued for the right to do that, so we all owe Chris Christie a thank you, of all people. But
gotta thank somebody, right?
You gotta thank somebody. But really, as far as the kiosks and everything, after a state legalizes it, then I'm sure there will be a more specific process by which they figure out where can you offer these things. For, what are the settings where it's appropriate? How far from a school or something before you can offer a sports bet? There will be a lot of conversation like that. So I think we're a few years away, but that future you described is very much coming.
Yeah, and I know also they one of the preseason games this year in the NFL, they even experimented with some stuff on the app as well, getting people, you don't even have to leave your seat, placing bets. And it's interesting. I mean, it's, minimal effort at this point in time. I think that's really the bottom line going forward.
And the big casinos in Las Vegas do offer apps. So MGM, Cantor Gaming, Wynn, I've got their apps on my phone. And sometimes, you can make your bet right at home without having to go to the window. It's that you can get a larger amount down at the window typically.
So, tell me the poker. Well, I want to get back to that because you're going to give me some little tips.
Sure.
Yes.
That I needed to know about. So, in doing this, you said there is a strategy, right? So, what is for a beginner, someone stepping into the game? What is something they must know, and what is a strategy they should go by in terms of poker?
Well, poker is really a game of patience. We were talking earlier about how if you go to a casino and you play something like baccarat or blackjack roulette, the outcomes are determined really quick. The hands are played out really quick. Yeah. Poker moves much slower than that. So players who show up and try and play it at the pace of those other casino games are inevitably going to lose because they're putting way too much money in way too frequently. So they have to understand that the poker is a game of patience, and it's a game of discipline, because you'll be there for hours and you'll go through periods where you don't have very good hands, and you want to do something that is outside of what you're actually supposed to do, out of what the hand chart would advise you to do. And every time you do something like that, it costs you money. You might win money today doing it, but over the long term, if you do it 1,000 or 10,000 times, you're costing yourself money. So learning the mental discipline to always make the right play and to make a tough fold when you're already down money and you're just so desperate to try and get even on the session. Those are the kind of things that aren't very specific. They're sort of vague, but are really important to doing this for a living.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing. Like we said, people who are looking to get into it for the first time. And even in Vegas, what is the best casino right now for someone who is just starting out and maybe they're a little hesitant, they're not really sure what they're doing?
I think that there are 4 properties in Vegas that are offering a range of games on any given night, especially on the weekends, and that's Wynn, Aria, Bellagio, and Venetian. There are some other casinos with poker rooms. They're just not as well trafficked, I would say. But, Caesars and the Orleans, if you're playing lower stakes, are some good spots to check out. But those 4 I mentioned are the big 4 in Vegas right now.
Now, you've been in Vegas for about how long have you lived?
Off and on for 8 or 9 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
And how are the locals feeling about professional sports teams? So we know the hockey team now, one whole season. It was a great year for them, Stanley Cup and everything. The Raiders are coming not too far away in 2020. Are people genuinely excited about professional sports in Vegas?
Shockingly so. I remember when they announced those teams coming to Vegas, I kind of thought, I don't think that'll really work. Vegas residents are mostly transplants. They're not going to be loyal to any teams here. They grew up with other teams. Man, I was so wrong. The Golden Knights were exactly what that city needed, especially following that unfortunate shooting last year. But the city really found some community over that team. And then the fact that they exceeded expectations so massively by making it all the way to the end, just gave the city something to root for. But also, I think people understood really quickly, like, hey, this is something cool that both the locals have, but people really will travel into Vegas just to come to these games. So seeing that executed so well with the Golden Knights makes me think we're in for more of the same with the Raiders. And I mean, hell, like, who doesn't want to both go to Vegas and go to an NFL game? I really think they partner very well together.
Oh, yeah, it's awesome, right? I mean, the big thing is, what do you do during the day? That's the one thing they're lacking, if anything, in Vegas. And, they're going to have that taken care of. And we've talked about this so much. I mean, if you're a fan, it doesn't matter which team you're a fan of, if your team is playing in Vegas, the Raiders, you're going to make a weekend trip out of it. It's inevitable.
It works perfect.
It's great, right?
And then you can imagine just the amount of money they're going to make. I mean, a Monday night game is going to be insane, right? They're going to come in on a Saturday, and that's like the package deals that they have. There is going to be insane. So Vegas is going to make a lot of money, man. I don't know. The Raiders, those guys, going to be some temptations for those guys to get on the strip and stuff, especially if it's someone who are poker players, because I know some Raiders people that are poker players. I don't think we need to talk to Tony.
Who should I watch out for on the table? Whose money am I going to take in the future?
Hey, don't tell Gruden, right?
Yeah.
Keep the coaches out of it. Let's talk fantasy.
Sure.
Huge fan, right?
Massive daily fantasy sports player. I love it. Yeah.
Obviously, what originally took you to that point where you are now is why you love it so much.
Right.
And I know you're really big on daily fantasy specifically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I got started in daily fantasy sports about 3 or 4 years ago. I was watching a friend who didn't know anything about football, like barely knew who the quarterbacks for each team was, but he was doing very well at this because he understood stats and analytics and everything. But he was asking for some advice about football, and I threw out some ideas to him, and then I watched as he won a tournament for $150,000 that weekend. I was like, oh my God, this guy who doesn't even know like the names of players is making all this money doing this. Now, that was a few years ago during the golden era of daily fantasy sports when money was falling from the sky. It's much more competitive now, but as a product, I find it incredibly compelling. I just love the process of researching all these players and researching the meta aspects of the team and the managerial decisions and what they're playing for, and then trying to assemble the best possible teams that also give me a chance to win a ton of money just kind of sitting around hanging out watching games.
I gotta ask you, the Le'Veon Bell holdout, how does that hurt you guys in terms of the amount of money you would make, because he is a top in the draft. He's a top pick, right? He holds out. How does it hurt the gambling world?
Yeah, if you're a seasoned fantasy player and you drafted Le'Veon expecting him to be playing for your team, you're really, really frustrated. As a daily fantasy sports player, it's not terribly relevant because they just say, all right, well, Le'Veon Bell is scratched, and do you want to play James Conner at this price? And then you have to evaluate, well, is it really the Steelers system that does so well for running backs, or was it Le'Veon Bell is crazy talented? So it's not so much that his absence is costing gamblers money as it is changing what they have to evaluate about whether it's betting on or against the Steelers or stacking the Steelers in a daily fantasy sports team.
Yeah, it's great question there, Keith, because we know just about there's someone, at least one person we all know who's affected by that, who is in a fantasy league at the moment, right?
It is
and
me.
It's crazy to put it in those terms.
Me.
And it's Keith.
Okay, so yeah.
So we have our own behind the mic with Brad Daly's fantasy league for the show here,
Right.
And Keith, he picks Le'Veon Bell, and thinking that he'll probably miss a game or two, but they'll have it resolved by week 3 at the latest. And
Sure, we all thought that.
And here it looks like the earliest is going to be is week 7. It is a crazy deal. As far as like comparing sports, favorite sport as far as doing fantasy for?
Football.
Yeah.
Nice.
But I actually think that, the results have been better in baseball for both myself and my roommate, who I do a lot of this fantasy with. But
right. Makes sense daily.
Yeah.
A little different.
Football is just so good. It's so fun, yeah.
It's incredible, right? One thing I'm talking with Tony Dunst here live behind the mic in studio on KABC Radio. We know fitness, eating right is a big part of you. It seems like that's the case now for all athletes here in 2018 and moving forward. But, that's really where it starts, right? With anything. It doesn't matter if it's physical or, in this case, a whole lot of mental preparation.
Yeah. And surprisingly, a lot of poker players in the last 5 years have come around to believing that being in the right kind of shape and the right kind of state of mind, getting enough rest, having a good diet are going to be very, very important to their edge. And like you said, almost every major sporting league has had kind of a revolution in how much the players and the coaches pay attention to those elements. I mean, you look at what these guys' diets were in, say, the NBA 20-ish years ago and what the habits were, and they would go out and they would drink and party in these towns they go to. Like, now these guys, they don't really drink. I have some friends who work with NBA players, and even when I hear about them going out to tables and to clubs in Vegas and getting a table, they drink water. Their guests drink the alcohol, So it's just a complete shift in mentality.
Floyd Mayweather's, I have to say that he does the same thing. He's a guy that drinks nothing but water, and he orders all these drinks for the people, his whole entourage, but he does not drink alcohol at all, which is interesting. I was like, wow, he has a big old wine cellar in his house, and he doesn't touch it.
Yeah. Hey, everything in moderation, or, hey, just cut it all out.
Right.
Whatever works best.
Or you go cold turkey.
Yes.
Yeah. Or you go with the John Daly plan, and you're like, nah, give it all.
Yeah. Hey, there's always that outlier,
There's
right?
always that guy, yeah.
Follow him across social media, Instagram and Twitter. It's at Tony Dunst TV. On Facebook, Tony Dunst Official. Tony, this was a lot of fun, man. Hey, great to have you in here. We'll have to chat with you again at some
my
point
pleasure,
down
guys.
the line. And enjoy your time in LA.
Will do, for sure.
Yes, thank you for coming, Tony. This is excellent.